Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Steve Birmingham, Vice President of Sales and Marketing here at Entellus. With me is Rob Flannery, the Director of Consulting Services. Rob's session today will cover Infor's Configuration Console and how this enhancement tool helps transform CloudSuite HCM, financials, and supply chain applications. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared via email after. For those with questions, please feel free to ask through the chat window. Rob will address these at the end of his presentation. I will be handing it over to Rob shortly, but before that, I would like to take a brief moment to give an overview of Entellus. Founded back in 1999 and with offices in Dallas and Chicago, Entellus is an Infor Alliance partner dedicated to providing technology, application, upgrade, and cloud services. In addition, we offer software solutions that assist in the areas of benefit enrollment and payroll functionality. So with years of industry experience, Entellus offers organizations like yours the expertise desired to attain your Infor goals. So again, thank you for joining us. At this time, I will pass it over to Rob.
Thanks, Steve. So a quick recap of the agenda Steve had highlighted. Three simple things to cover today. The what, why, and how of Configuration Console. So we'll focus on what exactly is CloudSuite, what does that mean, and what part does Configuration Console play in that solution. Why it's important, handling customization needs, extensibility within the application, and how we'll use it. So focusing on specific use cases and a live product demo. So I like to start by kind of breaking down what CloudSuite actually means. The term itself is applied to a number of different products, a number of different solutions, deployments. It can kind of get confusing. So when we're talking about CloudSuite as it relates to Configuration Console, we're really talking about two different products, the CloudSuite FSM and the CloudSuite HCM. CloudSuite FSM is essentially a rewrite of the Lawson version 10 finance and procurement applications on the Landmark technology platform. That's the same Landmark technology platform used for Infor process automation, if you're running that on-premise today, or in the case of CloudSuite HCM, that refers to a grouping of existing Infor products, most notably, the core, global HR, and talent management, which is the Landmark equivalent to CSF. Also within that solution would be the Lawson payroll, or the newly released global HR payroll, workforce management, HRSD, talent science, and the learning management solution. So the Configuration Console is going to play a big role in anything CloudSuite FSM, and then within the CloudSuite HCM, the global HR and talent management applications. The biggest question I get, especially from customers running Lawson 10 today, on-premise or in the cloud, is, well, what happens to my customizations? Maybe we have custom tables, interfaces, COBOL, etc. Where do those go? One of the big things with the CloudSuite is it's a rewrite of the applications, moving from a COBOL-based environment to Java. So things like Custom 4GL, even Design Studio, things like that, they have an equivalent, but we don't just move everything over like for like. And I think this table does a nice job outlining 5 major customization extension interface tools that may be used with the Lawson system today and what their equivalent would be in CloudSuite or version 11. I think the important thing to note here is that the Configuration Console is a viable solution, if not the solution, for almost everything. So a little bit of history of the Configuration Console. The tool itself is actually rather old as far as the enterprise software market is concerned. It's definitely not something brand new for CloudSuite. This tool has been around since Landmark version 10, which was first released in 2012. and really has evolved a ton since. But at its core, the configuration console ultimately allows users to configure application components to meet their specific business needs. The idea being we're moving away from customizing application delivered source code and instead creating configurations that sit on top of it and do not alter the delivered application. The configuration console is part of Landmark, and as such will be included with any Landmark applications you're running. And again, that Landmark runtime environment is the underlying technology / environment for the CloudSuite FSM and CloudSuite HCM application suites. Some examples of how this would be used. Again, we'll get into more specific use cases, but very simple ones would be, adding and removing fields from an application form, building user fields in the system, customizing lists, page views, menus, things like that. So really, most notably, it's for modifying the delivered user interface experience, making it more streamlined, efficient, robust, or whatever that might be, depending on if you're talking about manager views, employee views, power user views, really just tailoring it to meet your business users' needs. So I like to use this pyramid or this hierarchy to explain what exactly a configuration is, really as compared to a customization. How do these all relate to one another? So at the bottom level is going to be the delivered application code. That's the source code delivered by Infor for your CloudSuite applications, and it's not changeable. You won't have access to change it in some of the cloud deployments, and it's highly advisable to attempt to try and change it even if you have an on-premise deployment. That's where the configurations come into play. Ultimately, if there's an object we determine we want to change or we want to configure, we create a configuration using the configuration console, which is essentially a mutable snapshot of the current base code. We then change it however we see fit, whether we're changing a label, hiding fields, adding fields, whatever that might be. Then that will be published as the global view for all users. It's going to override the delivered application code, hence why it's sitting on top of it in our pyramid on the right. There's one other element to this, and that's going to be the personalizations. So the configurations are truly a global view. That means every user in the system now sees the configuration that has been created and applied over the delivered application code. We also have the ability to create a personalization. And as its name implies, that's a user-specific configuration for one individual. So it's a personalized, individually tailored view or configuration of whatever object we might be configuring. And that's going to sit on top of the delivered application code, and it also is applied over any global configurations by default. Hence why it's at the top of our hierarchy. So what can we configure? This is a ever-evolving list of things, but at a basic or high level, pretty much anything in the user interface. So list views within the applications, forms, pages, navigation menus, and then another huge use case is creating user fields. One of the big enhanced functionalities within Landmark is that we can create user fields on really any table or business class in the system, and we can create any number of them. We're not limited to what Infor says you can have user fields for or a number that Infor dictates. It's, theoretically, it's an infinite amount of user fields that can be created on any tables that are delivered within the application. So rather than talk about conceptually what this tool can do, we're going to go through a use case or example. The requirement being, customer needs to associate numeric codes for state reporting purposes on their position master or records within their position master in the system. There's not a delivered field for this out of the box, and we do not want to repurpose delivered fields. So the configuration console is going to be the solution for this. It's really a two-part solution. We're going to be creating a user field to store the values that are associated with the positions, and then we're also going to modify the form for position maintenance so that this field is displayed and exposed in a place that makes it easy for our HR compensation users to maintain it, whoever is responsible for that. So I'm going to jump over into the system here and actually demonstrate how to build something like this out. One of the underlying themes of this that I just want to call out, and I think will be evident as we go through this, is building with the configuration console is very quick, does not require any downtime, reorganizations of the system, things like that. And there's really a limited amount of coding, if any, involved in creating configurations. It's not like you need to be a developer to go in and work with this tool. So to launch the configuration, I'm in the Infor Rich client. That's a thick client tool that's installed on my PC. Currently, all the other functionality within Global HR is web-based. The configuration console is still a tool that needs to be accessed through this client for now. So that's why I'm in the Rich client. I'm ready to build out my configuration. So where I'm going to put this to, I think I'd like to show on the other tab here is my web browser. I'm in as an administrator for the GHR system, looking at my position master. If I open one of these up, we're going to build this user field, and I just want to show where we're going to place it. Pull up one of our positions, and we'll just prominently display it kind of right up top here, front and center. In a production setting, we probably wouldn't put it in the middle of the screen, but just to make it easy for the demonstration, we're going to put it right up top. So we're going to add a field here to store these user-defined codes and values for our positions. So to create a new user field, I'm going to configure a business class, configure the delivered position business class. I'm going to add an object, add a user field to it. To build the user field, a couple important elements have to be added. One is obviously the field name. We can pick a default label that will be displayed in the application, and then we specify a field type. In this example, going back to the PowerPoint real quick, we're going to have a list view of codes. So the state reporting agency may require some unique coding pattern, but we'll have descriptions, a state value list that has a nice descriptive label and also restricts entry into whatever's defined already in our list. So alpha 4 is going to store our code, and then we'll build states here. So for this example, we might do professional. So this is our data value that will be stored in the database, and this is our label, our nice looking descriptive label that will be put or displayed to the end user. So we had a couple states here. I'm not going to go through and do a bunch, just one or two for the purposes of the demonstration, and we save it. So I've now saved this user field. It's been added to the business class, and it's available for use. The way these user fields work, as far as the end user is concerned, it does appear as if we went in and just customized the table and added a field to it. It's that seamless. In reality, these configured objects are stored, or their metadata is stored somewhere in the database, and we're not. Again, this is the configuration console, not the customization console. So we're not customizing the database objects. We're not doing anything to the source code. It's going to sit separate from that. But we have built our field, and notice without any downtime, restarting, reorging, and what's now available for use. So the next piece of this is we're going to add it to our application. So I do a Control-Shift-Click here, kind of like Control-Shift-O if you're familiar with that in Lawson. We need to figure out the object we're going to add it to. So now we want to configure this form, LRC position, and we'll just put the field up here. So to do that, that form belongs to the position business class. You would see that here. So we're going to add, instead of a user field under position, we're going to add a configured form. We're going to configure a delivered form. So in that list, we should see LRC position. We'll go ahead and Looks like we need to go LRC position detail. We'll go in and actually we're going to modify this form, different one. And I'm going to add to this layout, go ahead and add our field, select it. Now that we've created it, even though it's a custom or configured object, it is part of the system now and it's available for selection. We can do things in here like change the label color, different styling elements, add data validation constraints, lots of options here. For now, we're just going to add it into the form. And this should take effect real time. So if I refresh my page, and here we go. State classification is available for selection in the system. If I click my, drop down, you'll see my two values are here, professional and admin. We don't see the code, so it's that nice clean description that will be much easier for users to select from when they're inputting data. Put our red label. Again, this could really be put anywhere in here. I just selected front and center to make the demonstration a little bit easier. So going back to here, back to the slides, notice there are a few limitations with this. So already we've built a user field, added it to a form. This is very powerful, but the limitations I would call out are, there's no filtering available, no searching. So if we had a long list to select from, that could be rather difficult. You'll notice they're not in alphabetical order. They're simply in the order that the states are defined. So that makes it very difficult to select from a long list. And you can't see the code values, which could be seen as a limitation as well. And obviously, the description is much more useful for humans to read, but there may be reasons or purposes that you would want the codes to display as well. So that takes us into, what's new with Configuration Console, what's new with CloudSuite. And I think a lot of that is packaged within the Landmark 11 technology runtime environment. So this is the underlying technology runtime environment or version for the CloudSuite. This is the latest iteration of the Configuration Console. And with that, it brings the ability to extend the application. So previous to Landmark 11, we were limited to true configuration. So we could only configure objects that Infor delivered in the application. But we were very limited in what we could create other than user fields. With Landmark 11, we truly get that ability to extend the application. We can create user-defined business classes or tables. We can build our own user-defined forms. We can add real-time scripting and validation rules into the application components. So one of the big ones a lot of customers ask me about is, well, we want our effective dates to be validated against the payroll calendar. Users can only put in pay period end dates when they submit actions in the system. Prior to Landmark 11, it was very difficult to do that properly with efficient data validation on the front end of the form. You kind of just had to trust your end users to know what those dates were, and then further down the process, either reject a bad date, manually fix it, or kick it back out with an email. Now with the real-time scripting validation rules and also exit and entrance rules, we can do a lot more of that data validation on the front end. We can also invoke process flows from pretty much any action in the system, which makes integration and automation much more easy to handle. And then we can also use these entrance and exit rules to do that extra validation or also integrate with the system. So, for example, if we wanted to, based on an update to a vendor record, push an update to another related business class or send a notification. Previously, with the old version of Configuration Console, that's really something we had to build an IPA flow for. And that IPA flow might take 1 to 3 weeks to develop, depending on how complex of a solution we were building. But the Configuration Console, a lot of that real-time integration, whether it be sending notifications on events that event-based, I guess, interaction, or pushing updates to other related business classes based on transactions that occur in another one. These exit and entrance rules are huge for. It allows us to basically capture events real time and do things with them and write the code all in the configuration console. So what I found is traditionally, having been someone, even 3, 4, 5 years ago that had to build IPA solutions to handle a lot of automation on these action-based events occurring in the system, can now have those replaced with configuration console exit rules and write them in, instead of 1 to 2 weeks, maybe 2 to 4 hours, and much, much less code, maybe 10 lines of code versus a whole IPA workflow. So it's faster and more efficient to build solutions, and I think these solutions are ultimately a lot easier to maintain than some of the traditional tools that we had available for use. So why does this matter? Ultimately, it's that configurability versus extendability in the system. What I found is prior to Landmark 11, going out and implementing, global HR, particularly because the CSF component never existed on the Landmark 10 platform. But there are a lot of gaps in functionality as far as these, customization requests were concerned. Customers would say, well, we do this in Lawson today, and we're going to global HR, and we need to have an equivalent. And because we can't customize or hadn't been able to, and because we couldn't extend the system, it made it very difficult to build solutions that work for customers to solve their business requirements. To show a little bit of a comparison on why this is such an advancement, I'm going to be looking at what Landmark 10 versus Landmark 11 can do. Different use cases, I guess, or customization use cases. Where Landmark 10 fell short, you can see on the bottom half of this, the last 3 solutions, Landmark 11 can handle natively. So I think it just provides a lot more flexibility, a lot more features, a lot more options for customers to be able to really tailor that application to their true business needs, where there may be a gap, to reach that kind of that last mile functionality, so to speak. So in the spirit of Landmark 11, we'll kind of expand on that last example and show how these new extensibility features can really improve even the simple solution we built out the first time. So in this case, we still have a requirement to associate state classification codes with positions, but we need the setup of these codes to be much easier for end users to maintain. As they stand now, it's built in the configuration console, which is not something we necessarily want the compensation department going in and modifying. They also want an ability for end users to search and drill on the values in the select list. Right now, it's static, and it's very difficult to work with, or would be difficult to work with if there were a number of values. We also want the ability to associate multiple codes with each position. So if we go back into the system today, you'll notice there's just one value here. And if I wanted to associate more, I would have to build more user fields. And that can be really messy because ultimately that's a finite limit. So you have to, at the time of building, say, well, we think we'll have up to 10 codes, but we're not sure. And then inevitably what comes is next year, well, there's now 15 codes associated with a position. We have nowhere to put them. It's also confusing, a little bit clunky to have all of these fields here and displayed when maybe only one of them will be used. So the ability to have that one-to-many dynamic relationship is important and something that the configuration console now can provide. So let's look at what that solution might look like. We're going to go back into the configuration console. We're basically going to extend on the solution that was built previously. We're going to replace the values in this list with values in a user-defined business class. So to build user-defined business classes, it's in the same place, the same configuration console. The difference is going to be, instead of working within the configured business classes, so making configuration changes to the Infor delivered business classes, we're going to create a user-defined business class, which is basically like a user field on steroids in terms of the options that are available. So same thing, we're going to create a state classification, business class this time. And the key field here is still going to be an alpha 4. That's going to be our coding scheme that we report to the state. We have to pick a contextual field here. This is what we'll basically say for our state classification codes, they are associated with the HR organization context. So what that means is the HR organization is like our Lawson HR company, so company 1. Tying this into a context, we'll say that each state classification that is defined belongs to an HR organization, and that's not something that the user is going to have to decide on when they create the records. It will be inherited from the user context. So whatever HR organization that user belongs to, as they're provisioning or viewing state classification records in our business class, it will automatically filter by the HR organization to which they are assigned. Typically, customers just have one HR organization in the system, and this will handle the defaulting for you automatically. So we built our primary key field here to hold our code, and we've defined our business class name. The next thing to do is add additional persistent fields. So any other attributes we would want to store on the state classification. That could be obviously a description is one that we'll want. So we're going to say this is an alphanumeric 50 field, add that on there. We could also build something like active. Maybe we want to track whether or not codes are active. All of this really depends on what type of data you're working with, but the options are they're not limitless, but there's a lot of flexibility here in what you can do. So we'll define active as a Boolean or a true or false value. We can set whether or not they're required, there's default values, things like that. We're basically associating a bunch of additional user fields with our user-defined business class. The next screen here is the security. So we are creating a user-defined business class. That is a custom object. And with the Landmark applications, all of the CloudSuite products come with pre-delivered application roles. So that's different than Lawson. You get a few out of the box, but pretty much you have to build everything on your own. With CloudSuite, all of the roles are delivered with standard template, this ST, and that's what you use as your starting point. So you have an admin role, an employee role, a manager role, an AP clerk role, a payroll role, etc. So they are all built with an understanding of only the delivered objects. So because you're creating a custom object, they're obviously not going to be aware of that. And potentially for like an employee or a manager, they may not have access to it. In some cases, that's good. In other cases, we need to make sure they can interact with that object, either viewing it, transacting on it, or whatever. So this screen is what's allowing you to handle that security provisioning automatically. So here we're going to select roles for which we want to have access to our object. And the configuration console will automatically create security classes with rules that grant access and assign those classes to the roles so that users can work with it. So in my example, I'm just going to pick admin to make it simple, but in a real use case or a real production setting, you'd likely be picking additional roles here for access. So I went ahead and click save, and it's creating my object. So it's told me that, yes, I've created this security class that grants the access, and I've assigned it to whatever roles you've selected. Hit OK. And at this point, the user business class, or really, for all intents and purposes, a custom table, has been created and is accessible. Again, no downtime, no reorgs, no logging out, no logging in, no cache refresh. It's all immediate. So I've created this object, and it's now available for provisioning or use, I guess, and maintenance. So the easiest way to get at this data is to just use the search bar here in my data menu. It's like a table view, a business class view that allows us to create records. In theory, we could take this much further and integrate the list view, into our web application and streamline the access and clean up the forms. I'm not going to go that in depth for the webinar. We're just going to go straight to the table to add records, but this is really satisfying that requirement of allowing end users to provision records. So within the application now, we can come in and simply create a record. So if we come in here and do the same thing, add a record, add another one. it active. There's 2 records here. If I want to delete one, can, no problem. The maintenance is very easy as compared to the first example we went through. All of these states are defined within the application code in the configuration console, which is fine, but can be really difficult to maintain if you have a dynamic list, a large list, a list that end users or business users are wanting the ability to manage. This is not a great solution for that. Now we have a business class object that can be maintained in the application, either manually, and we can also upload to it or query it using the Excel spreadsheet designer tool, which is the equivalent of the Microsoft add-ins. So it's a very powerful solution, and ultimately, although this is a custom object, it looks like and interacts with, or users interact with it like it was there out of the box, and they wouldn't otherwise really know that this is a custom object. So we've created our user business class, we've added 1 record to it, and at this point, we're going to go ahead and replace this functionality. So we don't want our drop-down list here, we want our select list from our user business class records. So how would we do that? The quickest way for the example is we're just going to actually come in and modify our existing user field. So if I go ahead and configure this, there's 2 options. So we have a field type, where we're explicitly saying this user-defined field has a field type of alpha, size 4, and users can put in whatever they want. Now we're actually going to remove this value, and we're going to specify a named type, or like an element. And so within our named type, if we come in and we say the name type is equal to our user-defined business class, what this means now is this user field has that state classification name type. It's going to inherit all of those properties and behave like an object within that business class. So automatically, it's going to inherit the select list with predefined values within our user business class. And it's going to restrict values to ones that have already been assigned in that business class. There's no additional work required to maintain the value list or field type or anything like that. It inherits it directly from how our user business class is defined. So now that I've updated that, we can go back into our application, go ahead and refresh the page, and we should see our new option here for selection. And so the difference is going to be, instead of that static drop-down that I was working with the last time, I now have this define list, or this drill list, to pull in a select from our business class records. So you see here the options I've created, or the records I've created in my user business class, are available. I can search on them. I can drill into them. They're all audited. So it inherits the audit log ability that is built into most of the Landmark applications. So we can see who created a record, when they did it, who updated it last, who deleted it. All of these records are audited. And it makes for searching and drilling into this select list much, much easier. So that's one enhancement. When we talk about, expanding on that example, it allows for setup of the state classification codes to be much easier for end users to maintain. It does provide that searching and drilling functionality on the list view to go through, let's say there were 500 codes in that list. Much, much easier to manage with the new list view that we built out. Now we'll talk about how we might go about associating multiple codes with each position. Go through these slides. They're basically covering or screenshotting all of the things I did in the live demo here. So one step further, how we would go about associating multiple codes. I talked about the limitation of a static user field and how that can really be a clunky solution when needing to associate multiple values with a business class, or we know that it's going to be a one-to-many relationship between our positions and the state reporting codes that we have to store in our system. So I'm not going to go through this with a demo, but I'll kind of walk through what the solution will look like, and the screenshot depicts what an end user might see. Again, everything you're looking at is configured or created in the configuration console in that black outline, But to an end user, they would really have no idea. It's very seamlessly integrated, tightly integrated, very easy to use. And so what this allows us to do is tie in a list view which associates a dynamic and ultimately, infinite list of codes with each position, and that list can be maintained right within the application on the form that a HR or compensation person will be using to maintain their position master. So there's really only 2 more steps required to do that, and these are both things that Landmark 11 Configuration Console would provide. The first thing would be we'd go in and we'd create another user business class. So we already created one to store our codes. What are our codes? What are those sequential values? 001, 002, what do they mean? Are they active? So that's our master of state classification codes. We would then need to create another user business class. This user business class would store the association of a position code to its state classification codes, and it would allow for one position to be associated with multiple codes or have multiple records within that business class. So all of that information would be stored in our new user business class, probably called position state classifications, something like that. The only other final step then would be to create a user-defined relation. So another powerful feature within the configuration console is we can build relations from a database perspective, ultimately, between business class objects. So obviously, because we built state classification as a user-defined business class, Infor would not have a predefined relationship between the Infor delivered position business class and our custom state classification business class. So we would use configuration console to build a relation that says a position has a one-to-many relationship between itself and our position state classification table that's storing the position code and its respective state classification codes. That relationship would then be used to associate this list view with the form and allow for the inline maintenance and visibility of the state classification codes that are tied to each position. A few other notable features that we just quite frankly don't have time to cover on a webinar and it would be more suited for a formal training, but noteworthy enough to call out would be, again, these action, entrance, and exit rules. These are huge. I find that they're really eliminating the need for what had traditionally been done with IPA, reducing the number of IPA workflows, streamlining the amount of code written to handle solutions. Ultimately, that action-based logic event rules firing. So on an update of some record, we send a notification. We trigger an IPA flow. Maybe we do want to do something with IPA. Perhaps we want to update records in another business class. We can do all of that using the configuration console now. And that would be through the entrance and the exit rules. The entrance being rules that fire as a transaction is being committed to the database, but before it is, and the exit rules firing after that transaction is committed. So this is very similar to traditionally, with COBOL, the user exits that were pretty prevalent on the Lawson system. Web application. So this is another big use case. If you go back to the new, my system's running the new it's called the SOHO 4.0 responsive control design. But this landing page for the application here is all configurable with configuration console. So particularly for an employee view, a manager view, something like that, we may want to remove certain menu items from here. Let's say we are not doing performance appraisals until 2022, and we don't want employees to see that that functionality is there. The configuration console can be used to hide that. It can also be used to add links to other third-party systems. Maybe you do your applicant tracking or something like that outside of Infor, or payroll outside of Infor, whatever that might be. It's still a self-service function, just not within Infor. Well, you can add a link to that within here so that you have a unified single source of truth or place for the employees to go or the managers to go and do their work. So these application start pages are new. with the new Landmark 11 and responsive control design, and the configuration console is used to update them. The other piece is creating user-defined UI elements. So one of the biggest limitations before Landmark 11 was, well, we can only configure delivered objects. So for example, we know there's a list view or a form view in the application that we want to change, but we only have one because Infor only gave one, and we can't create custom objects. So we have to create one configuration, one global view of that object that satisfies the needs of every user in our organization. Sometimes that's unrealistic. Sometimes it's because the employee has a different experience than the HR generalist, or users within the field on our HR side are different from users in the corporate office. And we really want different views tailored to how those people use the system. Well, now with the configuration console, we can do that. We can create user-defined lists, user-defined forms, completely custom objects there that can be integrated with the manager-based web application or the generalist-based web application, really enhancing usability, functionality, reporting, all within the system. So some final thoughts to kind of close this up. Really, if you haven't heard about the configuration console before, or this is your first time really exploring it, and CloudSuite, Global HR or CloudSuite Financials is in your immediate future, become more familiar with this tool. It is absolutely going to be crucial to the success of your CloudSuite project. It's going to be the tool or the solution that handles really that final 10%, that last mile functionality that maybe, ultimately with any implementation of ERP, we try to stick to the out of the box, to the application delivered as much as possible. That's not always possible. There's always something we need to change, configure, extend, custom tailor for our business or some unique niche need you may have. The configuration console is the tool that's going to do that for you. Landmark 11 brings many, many improvements to the configuration console. So maybe you're familiar with the tool, maybe you've worked with it in the past, but you haven't really seen it with Landmark 11. It's a brand new tool, and there's a ton of new functionality in it, and I really think it's a huge improvement over what traditionally had been available on Landmark 10. And so with that, if you're running Landmark 10 today, maybe on premise, even if you just have IPA, or you are running Global HR with Landmark 10, or you're cloud hosted, on-prem, whatever, really consider upgrading ASAP. I think there's so much functionality in the new version of Landmark as it pertains to the configuration console that you're really missing out by not being there, either in being able to deliver solutions to your business end users or by having to write and deal with, large, clunky IPA flows or other solutions that could be streamlined and improved with some of the new functionality in that configuration console. With that, that concludes the end of our content for the presentation. I'd like to open it up for any questions that might be available. And again, my name is Rob Flannery. I'm the Director of Services here at Entellus. My email is up on the screen. And then Steve Birmingham, our Vice President of Sales, was the one who opened the call. His contact information is there. We'd be happy to take any questions off the chat, or if you want to unmute your line. Or otherwise, obviously, our contact information is right here, and you can go ahead and reach out directly.
Hi, Rob. This is Chad. Wanted to relay some questions that are coming from the chat window. One of the questions was, what happens when you upgrade? What happens to the configurations that you do? How do you move those to the new upgraded code?
Sure. So that is a good question. Ultimately, the configurations sit on top of the underlying source code. So when the application source code or the delivered code is updated with a CU from Infor, the configuration will remain as is. There will be a validation that occurs to make sure it's still valid. For example, it is not referencing a field or something that has been since removed from the delivered application, which would invalidate it. but otherwise they largely remain as is, as they were created however many months or years ago. And so that's an important point to understand, is that as the application is upgraded underneath these configurations, without any manual intervention or maintenance of these configurations, you're not going to inherit any of the changes or enhancements that come necessarily with the underlying source code. So for example, on a hire screen, if updates have come out that have pushed a new field onto the hire an employee screen in the system or vendor maintenance screen in the system, and your configuration was created before that enhancement came out, nothing is going to automatically put it into your configuration. That is something you'll need to maintain as part of that upgrade process. And I think that's important to understand because, as you've seen in this presentation, it is a very powerful tool. It is a very easy tool to build things with, but it should be controlled because allowing many configurations to be created might be great initially during your implementation, but down the line, understand that there's a cost with that. You do need to maintain them. Even though Infor doesn't like to use the word customization, from a support perspective, as in terms of our internal, business analysts, systems analysts at the customer site, they still have to maintain this stuff during upgrades, and it needs to be migrated and merged with any changes that may have come with the application if you want to stay current. So with that, that kind of explains the process, and I would encourage you to really use trying to stay to the delivered out-of-the-box functionality as a guiding principle in any CloudSuite implementation you do. I mean, the configuration console is going to be there for that maybe last 10% of the solution, but really limit what's done in that tool to what's truly needed by the business, not just because one individual in the department might like to have it. It truly needs to be a justified business case for creating things and objects within its configuration console, because they do ultimately have to be maintained long term.
Excellent. That's all the questions from my end. Unless you have any questions, I'm going to turn it back over to Steve.
Yeah, there's one more
thank
here.
You, Chad. Oh, there is. Sorry.
Sorry, Steve. There's one more here. Someone sent me a private message. Can I have a configuration for a group of users but not all users? Example, I want nobody but HR to see SSN on the screen. Ultimately, yes, there are ways to do this. The configuration console in combination with potentially security, which is also something that's handled in the configuration console. If you do modify those delivered standard template roles, should be able to handle this. And that's it. I didn't see any other questions.
Okay. Well, again, this is Steve Birmingham. This will conclude today's webinar. Once again, thank you very much to everyone. We appreciate you joining, and we look forward to any future conversations. Have a great day. Take care.